Welcome back to the Church Resource, where we talk about all the best resources for churches, leaders, and lay people. I'm here with Dr. Chris Respass.
Yeah, man.
My name is Lucas Pinckard.
It is Lucas Pinckard. Indeed, it is.
It's not Chris. We were just talking about it. So we just talked about youth camps and like getting to youth camp, planning for youth camp, that kind of stuff. We've got some folks from Fuge who are going to come visit with us in a few weeks and kind of talk to us about best practices for getting all that stuff planned, whether you go to their camps or somewhere else.
Right.
They're not paying for us to have them on. Yeah, we just got some relationships there where they're like, yeah, hey, we can do it. Excellent. I want to know, because we've experienced this every year, how you help kids manage coming back home after the camp experience.
Oh, my goodness.
And whether it's camp, whether it's a Disciple Now, a mission trip, a weekend retreat, like whatever it is, right? When we get that time alone, we can all get pretty fired up. Things are going really well. And, you know, we're away from all of the things that are actually causing us problems, whether they're at school or in the home or at the workplace or whatever. And then you come home and all of those wonderful feelings that you had, all of those promises that you made to Jesus at the altar.
Buddy.
Like, sometimes as soon as you get into that bus and open your Instagram up, it's like, nah.
That's it.
Yeah, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. I'm just
in
done
the
with
fast
it.
lane.
Yeah, so how do we help students and really our lay leaders who are there, you know, manage coming home and staying committed, staying true to the promises and stuff that they made while they were at camp?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate you in expanding it to include, you know, the staff that went down, the volunteer staff, the chaperones, you know, the counselors, if you will, that you brought from your church, because everybody is coming back fired up, often with a different perspective, you know, with a different lens, not only on the ministry, but also on life, you know, to a certain extent. And it's very hard because you're energized. You know, you kind of have been living in this, operating in this utopian kind of
in a bubble.
Yeah, in a bubble, right?
And a lot of times you're seeing, and this is just the truth of it, is like you're experiencing life from a different angle, right? Because you're removed. Like, you know, we sent our students to Glorieta, New Mexico, right? That we ain't got no mountains, right? You can stand on my roof and see Dallas, which is 30 miles away from here, and like you're looking at it. You don't need binoculars. You don't need anything.
It's
just,
right there.
That's it. There's Reunion Tower.
Right.
You know, you get out there and you can't see 15 miles away because there's mountains and stuff everywhere. So you get like that natural beauty that's out there, and then you get to see the cute boys and the cute girls from different regions of the country that are coming out. So there is, on top of the fact that you're removed from everything, there's a whole new world of different distractions where you're like, you know, Man,
heaven's gonna be nice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I was talking to a buddy of mine today. We were talking about youth camp, and he was like asking me how it was. I was like, yeah, you know, we went back to the mountains. Like it was great. And he goes, you know, it just makes me upset about the Garden of Eden. I was like, right, because if this is the trash,
that's right.
this is the leftovers. That place had to have been amazing, right?
You know it.
You're like, cannot wait to get there. So yeah,
so,
you're right.
So I think you know, so what do you do when you get back home? I think you know, I wasn't very successful in you know, creating an extended version of this, but the goal was to help use that experience as a target to whether it's the energy or the camaraderie or the focus, whether it was the elimination of certain distractions, whether it's, you know, the quality time with God. Use those things as goals or markers to continue to build upon and implement, right, in their life. And so for me, you know, when I was a youth pastor, it was, okay, how do I, without being disingenuous, right, like how do I create that kind of energy and excitement, right, just in the ministry, right, not flicking the lights and not always having to have.
Yeah, you don't have to have a strobe light and a fog machine, right? Yeah.
And all that. But how do I use the time that I have with the young people, to make it exciting and winsome and engaging in a way that they're excited. And then the other side was how can I help them grow to appreciate a life that is less cluttered by Instagram and now TikTok and always being having to have somebody else around me, like to value being still or being quiet,
Yeah.
right, and helping them see that it first of all, it's not a bad thing, right, having some alone time with God or building and nurturing relationships with other believers is not being lame, right? But it's something that's actually enriching. It is settling and it's foundation strengthening, and it's a task. It's hard because, like you said, coming from the mountains and coming to the flatlands, if you will, right?
Bro,
you know what I'm saying? It's kind of a change, right? And going from not having to worry about football practice to having to worry about that, or going to work now and preparing for the next school year, right? It's just a different environment, but we can still use those experiences as a goal or as a marker or a target, that for our students to strive for, and for us as leaders try to help for ourselves to strive for it too.
Right? Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, we're just as tempted by our responsibilities and things that are the happenings around us as they are.
Yeah, it's such a challenge to figure that out, right? And one of the things that I heard when I was at a camp, we were talking with we were probably seniors in high school, and it was cry night. Right, every camp's got a cry night.
Yeah.
So it was cry night at the camp, and we're all talking, and one of the guys, said something that I thought was pretty, pretty wise for somebody our age.
Right.
Was like it doesn't matter like how high you get; it matters like how straight when you walk whenever you come down, right? And that was one of the big things for me that kind of shook me up. Was like, this feeling is not something that we need to chase, and I think that that's a big thing to relay to students, because I think that's something that a lot of the emotional church movements have kind of leaned into.
Sure.
Right, is that what we're chasing is this feeling, but you can get that feeling at a concert.
Yes.
Right. That doesn't mean that it's the Holy Spirit that's doing it. And there's a big distinction there, that it's not so much like we need to be chasing that feeling. If God's showing us this grace and all of this in this one moment, then that's amazing. But what we need to be chasing is that fellowship with God and that fellowship with one another, like you were talking about, the relationship building. And realizing, too, from a leadership standpoint, that there are going to be the kids that like get impacted because of TikTok and Instagram, that that's where they're going to be taken down that road. Others, whenever their schedules get busy, that they come back from camp and they're fired up and they're serving in the kids ministry for the first 4 or 5 weeks,
right?
And then football practice starts in 2 days and they're like, nah, I can't do this anymore.
That's right.
So you'll have some of that too, but the other thing that I think that you'll get is you're going to have these kids that are at camp that somebody sponsored for them to go to camp. But camp is going to be the first time in a long time where they've had uninterrupted sleep, where they've got 3 full meals a day. And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that, like, for some of these kids, that utopia of camp is that they're getting the things that other kids in our group take for granted.
Absolutely.
And figuring out how to strike the balance between those, because at camp everybody's kind of on the same playing field, right? We all had the same thing for lunch, good, bad, or indifferent. We all have lunch at the same time. We all went to the same worship. We're playing the same games and those kinds of things. And so there are less things within a social setting that pull us one way or another.
Right.
And when we get home, whatever that, for lack of a better way to put it, that caste system looks like is implemented, as soon as we pull back up to the church building. So one of the big keys there is like helping your students, helping your leaders maintain those relationships that they had with one another whenever they were at camp, whenever they were in those moments of church group devotion time, or whether you went to one of those camps like we talked about that it's focused on the church,
right?
Those types of things, helping them to maintain those relationships, because when life hits, whenever they come home, the circumstances and the issues that they have are going to be as diverse as each one of those students are. Whereas at camp, a lot of the opportunity for vulnerability is that, it's a lot easier to talk about when I get home, I'm worried about where my next meal is going to come from when you've had enough sleep and a full belly than it is whenever you're going through it and you're trying to prevent, yourself or your family from experiencing that shame. Yeah. Right. So, we live in a pretty affluent area, but within that, the elementary schools in our community are all Title I. Yeah. Right. So we know that there is that disparage. It's something that we've got to figure out with not just the families in our church, but within our students. So when we're coming back with that, what things do you recommend that we do from a leadership standpoint in order to keep these kids in fellowships with one another, or in fellowship with one another, before their cliques start to break them apart?
Kick in.
Yeah.
It goes without question that our students kind of already know. Yeah. Right. The school you go to, when I was coming up, it was the free lunch, right? Free lunch, reduced lunch kind of thing. So they already are exposed to the economic disparity, even of their church group, right? Their youth group. So they're already aware of it. But you hit on something that I think is important is, when you're at camp, everybody's pretty much on equal footing, right? Well, I think that has to carry over, but how, when you return, but what is that common denominator, or shall I say, who is that common denominator? Yeah. And I think that it presents us an opportunity to lift high not only the bloodstained banner of Christ, but to lift Christ up, right, as that one figure who unifies us regardless of our diverse experiences. Right. And so I think championing Christ and helping our students, to see him, and notwithstanding whatever our, individual circumstances are, that he becomes the one that is the bridge, right? He becomes the one that links us together, and by highlighting him, we're better able to minimize those things that would be divisive, right? Yeah. Because the cliques are coming, right? Like
for sure, right?
And especially when we go to these camps. Depending on whether you're taking your youth group or your middle school group or your high school group, there's still going to be some distinctions between them, right? Yeah. And especially if you were like me, we had middle school and youth, and high school that would go. They would be closer together in terms of their grades, but they were still in very different contexts. So these cliques are coming, but I found that whenever we have done a good job in laying down Christ as the foundation, right, then our students were willing to wait a second before they did the thing that that they would naturally do, right? Before the junior in high school was like, shut up, little one, or get out of here, right? They would wait a second, and then how they engaged, with the eighth grader, right, would be impacted, I think, by them having a better understanding of Christ, putting us all on equal footing.
That makes it 100%, man. And that's one of those things that, like, when you get home, that as children of the 80s and 90s, as we are, right? Yeah. the Breakfast Club mentality. You know what I mean? Like, oh, everybody, we all got detention together, and so we're gonna hang out all day and whatever. Like, you know, when Monday came for those kids to go back to school, like they like gave each other kind of like the knowing nod, and then that was it.
Yeah.
And there's something about that to an extent, as if you can maintain just that little bit of it, that's something.
Yes.
Right. But you look at, you know, to use another, even though it's a more modern reference, right? Like the Stranger Things kids, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so they all got pulled out of their clique because they are experiencing all kinds of crazy stuff, right?
Yeah, stranger stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And supernatural things and all this. While we relate to that show, and that's a beloved show for a lot of reasons, that idea is one that should be most prevalent in the church.
Yes.
Is that, you know, we are now bound together by something that is supernatural that we've experienced together and all of those kinds of things, which is what you were talking about. It's salvation. It's our new identities in Christ.
Right.
And I think we've gotten away from moving students in that direction. One of the big conversations that we had with our youth leaders at this camp, and so that, you know, camp is the ones that I preached were about 500 campers.
Okay.
And then you'd have about, you know, 10 to 12% of that 500 were leaders.
Okay.
So you've got all these leaders who have to be here with these kids, right? Because they're trying to keep that like 10 to 1 or 8 to 1 ratio, whatever it is. So you got 50 youth leaders, and the big conversation that we were having is that there is this vast disparage in Gen Z and Gen Alpha between biblical knowledge, like knowledge about the Bible, which a lot of them find out on social media, like, oh, I believe that I can trust the Bible because of these, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's all these interesting ancient archaeological digs and stuff like that, and biblical literacy, which is actually knowing what's in the book.
Right.
And what we were finding is that, like, as we were talking about it, that the leaders kind of had that same thing. That, you know, maybe they read Case for Christ or Case for Faith or 90 Minutes in Heaven or like one of these or what's the one, the Josh McDowell book, More Than a Carpenter, right? You read these books that talk about all of this stuff, and you're watching J. Warner Wallace and you're watching your Frank Turek's and all of those guys, and so they know really how to defend their faith, but they don't actually know very much about what is in the scriptures itself. Right. And when we focused them in on that was really the unifying piece, was less about the camp, less about doing all this other stuff. You know, I ended up just kind of teaching a small class, like we talked about atonement. And I was like, this is a word I'm going to use for your students, not because it's a theological word, but because the word right here says atonement, right? That's what's in the scripture. That's what we're going to use. And some of your students are going to have the word propitiation in there.
Yeah.
And y'all need to figure out what it means.
That's right.
The best conversations that I had with the leaders all week was when they were coming up to me and they're like, hey, so I looked up the definition for atonement. Help me with this. They got kids that are at camp.
Right.
I'm not calling any of them out, but like this is a big thing. And when we're talking about uniting them back around Christ, it's about what's in the book itself. It's about what's in the scripture, not this topical thing, not just like, hey, here's this or here's this cool little nugget about this one word or whatever.
Right.
But bringing them, inviting them into a place where they can study the scripture and get into the word themselves, because that's what's going to, you know, advance the spirit. That's what's going to create all that vulnerability. And more than anything else, that's what's really going to recreate the fellowship that they had at camp, is around the word itself. So when we talk about that, for a lot of us, that's going to be a dramatic shift.
Yeah.
We talked about kind of the fighting of the culture and those kinds of things. One of the other things that I think gets kind of looked over is particularly in medium to large churches, right? Like, we're not talking mega churches. We're talking churches, you know, you got, let's say 150 to 250 would be considered a medium church, and then 251 to maybe 400 or 500 is your large church. Okay. There's, statistically speaking, those churches and bigger than that are less than like 15% of all churches in the United States, right? It's a really, really small percentage.
Right.
But when you get into that range, there's a lot of students that go to churches that's their first church experience because they've got the budget to do, the bells and whistles and all those kinds of things.
Sure.
One of the other things you fight when you come home from a church that's that size, right? Like our youth group in the church that I grew up in was 300 students.
Right.
You've got 250 that went to camp, and you got 50 that didn't.
Right.
The reintegration of those 50 is just as important as making sure that 250 that went or whatever.
That's right.
And even if it's split up, you got 15 that went to camp and 5 that didn't.
Right.
Right. Making sure that those 5 now don't feel ostracized because they couldn't go to camp, whether it was a financial thing, whether it was a workouts thing because they had to be at athletics or something like that. They're mathletes and they went down and did the robotics class and, or whatever.
Absolutely.
Whatever happens with those 5, that they don't feel ostracized. So the last bit I kind of want to talk about is how do you help with that reintegration when these 15 have had this breakfast club or this kind of Stranger Things sort of experience that we see personified in movies, that now these other 5 don't have any part of.
Right.
How do we prevent that group from fracturing?
Right.
Because of camp.
Of that, yeah. Well, I tell you, I appreciate you bringing this up because it is so easy to just get back and trudge on, right? Just keep your foot on the gas and keep trying to run, and you forget that everybody didn't have that common experience.
Right.
And it may be some of them didn't want to go.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
some
that's
of them,
another.
You know
that's
what I
another
mean?
part too,
so,
right?
Some of them didn't want to go, but some of them really did and couldn't for whatever reason.
Right.
And so I appreciate you bringing this up. I do think one of the ways that we can help to keep that group from fracturing is to take that experience and unpack it for the entire group, or let's just say those 50 or so that didn't make it. If they're in the across the age groups, right? You just have your teachers just kind of unpack what happened at the camp.
Yeah.
Right. So that as you're going for, because one of the benefits of as many of the youth going is that now you have a common language, right? You have some metaphors and some analogies and some imagery, right, that you can use to help reinforce what you're teaching.
Yeah.
But it's only maximally effective if everybody gets it, right? And what I found is that if you kind of come back and you say, hey, you remember, the father Abraham, example or whatever, and then you say, this is what it was about, and you can use it as you're just kind of refreshing everybody else's recollection. But for those that didn't attend, it's their first, exposure to it. But you're helping, bring them along so that they're not just sitting there, with everybody else having an inside joke, and they have no idea what's talking about, because it does make them feel ostracized, and it can remind them that we didn't have enough money, right? Or I had other obligations.
Yeah, I chose football over this for a reason.
Absolutely,
right? And that's a real thing.
It's a thing. It's a thing. There was no place for me there, but there was always a place for me here. And then unintentionally, you kind of set them up to chase an idol.
Yeah.
Perhaps. And so, so for me, I really think creating a common language and doing it in such a way that it introduces those who miss camp, to the concepts without reinforcing the fact that they missed it, right? So, so it's a summary, it's a recount, a restatement of what everybody went through. And I would do that every time, you wanted to use that as an analogy. And for what it's worth, the youth need that refresher anyway. Seemed like
for sure.
The more I taught, I needed to reteach the stuff I'd already told them. And then last thing for us to keep in mind is, thankfully, if those 50 have been relatively active in the youth ministry, then they've got friends, right? So it's not like they're newcomers to the group. They just kind of missed this experience.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so they still have connection points within the overall youth ministry. And so that gives us at least a platform from which to do this.
Yeah. I hated the summer attrition that happened. And I noticed as a student that this was one of the things that it was kind of around. And we did, our church was great growing up because we would do, you had middle school week, then you had high school week of camp, and then there was always a mission trip that you could go on. And a lot of times, because I was involved as a leader, I would get to do, at least camp and the mission trip every year. Mm. And there was these cliques that formed around like, oh, hey, these are the kids that went to camp. And then these are the kids that went to the mission trip. And then these were the kids that went to the mission trip and to camp. And that was an even smaller circle than either one of these other ones were, because a lot of them had to choose one or the other. And I was very blessed because there were families within our church, I don't know who they were, that because I was a young leader, that they were like, no, if he wants to go do both, we'll pay for him to, help the family do this kind of a thing, which we wouldn't have been able to afford to do. And it was, like I said, just a tremendous blessing to us. But that group that did both, we were looked at as different, right? Because we were allowed to. Nobody knew that we were being sponsored. And so there was an economic view of the kids who could do both. There was also like a uniting of that group because we were able to do both. And there was another aspect of it where people almost put us in like a super Christian category because we did do that. Yeah. And then you had the kids that could do one or the other. And then you had the kids that could do neither. And the kids that could do neither were often the ones that, at the beginning of the school year, they were disconnected from the group. Right. And those were the ones that we oftentimes, come October, November, we're like, oh man, why hasn't Edgerrin been to church in a while? Right. We throw back to a random, kid name for whatever. Yeah. But like that was one of those things that was really heartbreaking for me as I was growing and maturing, was realizing that like, maybe the reason that they never came back, maybe the reason that, this family, Jim and John, maybe the reason that they never came back was because, they felt less than, or they felt like they weren't part of the group, or even though they were part of the group, that we had so many shared experiences, so many inside jokes, all those things, that the way in which we communicated changed so dramatically, right, that they felt like, nobody cared anymore. Right. And then when nobody reaches out to them until October, November, that is kind of, verified, to them that was the case, right? So, and I do think that's
huge, man. Yeah, I mean, listen, we do have to lead with a degree of sensitivity, and it's so easy to be caught up with all the excitement and energy of going to camp, but we don't want to unwittingly, create this, to create a situation that undermines the goal that we have.
100%.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like never even thinking that camp, right, it could be a tool that ends up being divisive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or ostracizing, or reinforcing someone's perception that they're not valued or cared about.
Yep.
So I think that's huge, because even as you're talking, I never really thought about that. Mm-hmm. I just never did. They couldn't go, and the other side of that is when you knew that there were circumstances, and let's say the church for whatever reason could not help overcome that. Yeah. You know what you do before camp? You end up kind of pampering them. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like, you're trying to care, but I don't know how helpful that is.
Right.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. You're trying to express that your regret, that they can't come, but at the end of the day, you can't come.
Yeah.
So.
And coming home, I think the biggest thing that we hit on is just being intentional. Whether it's being intentional with follow up, being intentional with the way that you structure your curriculum, or the way that you structure your conversations about camp and bringing everybody else into the fold, those kind of debriefs and those kinds of things, being intentional with those students who weren't able to make it for one reason or another, whether that, it was, personal programming with sports or clubs or those kinds of things, whether it was a financial thing or whether it was because, more and more students these days are just like, I just don't want to leave home.
Right.
Whatever that is, not just helping those students to reintegrate into the group, because there will be a little bit of that, but also remaining intentional with them, remembering to coach your young leaders. Like, this is an opportunity for them to learn to build up some trust, respect, some loyalty and stuff, and some influence in the lives of those students. And primarily remembering that we are united, like you said, under the bloodstained banner of Jesus Christ, and that our identity is in him, no matter what our socioeconomic circumstances are, no matter what clique we belong to for one reason or another, that when we come home, our united mission is to bring the gospel back, that we're not chasing a feeling, that we are chasing that the desire to walk as he walked.
Yes.
Right, and that's the goal, man.
Yeah.
Dude, this was a good conversation for me.
Yeah, me
man,
too.
You know, having left preaching camp and now coming back to some students that have just gotten back from camp, you know, remembering all of this, because we've got kids on every side of this.
That's right.
You know,
that's right,
so
bro.
That's awesome, man.
That's good.
I appreciate you, Dr.
Appreciate
Respass.
you.
Well, thank you guys for listening. If y'all have recommendations of topics you want us to cover or resources you think we need to take a look at, you can send us an email at thechurchresource@gmail.com. That's thechurchresource@gmail.com. And until next week, y'all have good. Get Gav, and we'll see you.
Holla.